The night pressed down like a heavy cloak, the kind that made the air feel thick and unwelcoming. The street was nearly empty, save for the occasional hum of cars racing past, their headlights casting fleeting, ghost-like shapes across the cracked pavement. The glow from a single street lamp sputtered and flickered, buzzing faintly as though it fought against the dark. Its pale light spilled unevenly across the sidewalk, just enough to reveal a small figure sitting very still at the edge of the curb. Lily Johnson sat with her knees drawn close to her chest, a battered cardboard box balanced carefully on her lap. Inside the box lay Daisy's white petals, some curling at the edges from the chill, others still bright and soft as though clinging to life with her. She had picked them earlier that day with painstaking care, arranging them neatly as if the effort alone could make them more valuable. To her, they were more than flowers. They were a chance, however fragile, to buy medicine for her mother, who lay weak and sweating in the cramped apartment only a few streets away. Her dress, once sky blue, had dulled into a pale shade that seemed more like memory than color. It hung loosely from her thin shoulders, clinging to her frame, but offering little warmth against the biting wind. Strands of blonde hair whipped across her cheeks as the breeze moved down the street, tangling and tugging, but she didn't raise a hand to fix them. Her fingers gripped the box too tightly, small knuckles white with the determination of someone who knew that letting go might mean surrendering the last bit of hope she had left. People came and went in flickers, like shadows to hurry to notice her. Boots and polished shoes tapped against the sidewalk, heels clattered briefly before fading. But no one stopped. Now and then someone's eyes would land on her, their gaze quick and uncomfortable, before sliding away as though ashamed to have noticed. Some smiled politely, but their hands stayed buried in their pockets, unwilling to part with even a coin. Lily's lips trembled, but she clenched them together and lifted her chin. Crying was dangerous, she knew it from the pit of her small chest. Tears, she told herself, would make her weak, and weakness meant failing her mother. Her mother, whose face haunted her thoughts, flushed with fever, breath shallow and ragged, hands clammy and limp when once they had been warm and strong. The doctor's words had been confusing, full of terms she couldn't grasp, but she understood enough. Medicine, money, two things she did not have, except perhaps through the daisies. The night grew colder, the damp air seeping into her bare feet until they were numb against the concrete. Still she stayed, hugging herself now and then when the wind cut too sharply. She whispered promises to herself, soft enough that only the night might hear. Tomorrow will be better. If someone buys tonight, tomorrow will be better. She pictured her mother's eyes opening wider, her breathing easing, her smile returning. That vision kept her rooted in place. But as hours dragged on, exhaustion pressed at her eyelids. She jerked her head upright each time it began to dip forward, terrified she would miss the one person who might stop. Around her, the city's sounds dulled into a low murmur, the silence stretching between each passing car until it felt as though she were the only soul left awake. The box of daisies sat like a fragile beacon on her lap, glowing faintly beneath the faltering streetlight. They were her lifelines, each petal of fragile hope fluttering against the indifference of the world. And still she waited, heart steady but small, never knowing if the night would end with salvation or with nothing at all. The night air was crisp, sharp enough to sting the lungs, but Richard Hayes hardly noticed. His pace was brisk, his gaze fixed ahead, and his thoughts were tangled in contracts and meetings that seemed to stretch endlessly behind. And before him, his driver was waiting a block away, a sleek black car idling beneath the glow of a streetlight, ready to ferry him back to his penthouse high above the city. That was his routine: meetings, numbers, negotiations, the quiet hum of wealth that insulated him from the world's rough edges. He liked routines. They kept him in control. Richard was a man who rarely stopped. His schedule was carved into stone, his movements precise, his decisions swift and cold. People admired him for it, feared him even an empire built on that unyielding momentum. Stopping meant vulnerability, hesitation, two things he had trained himself never to allow. Yet as his polished shoes struck the pavement in sharp, rhythmic beats, something flickered at the edge of his vision. At first, he thought it was nothing more than a pile of discarded rags huddled beneath a broken street lamp. This neighborhood was scattered with such shadows, and he usually passed them without a thought. But tonight, without warning, his stride faltered, just slightly, enough to unsettle him. He turned his head. It was not a pile of rags. A child sat there small, too small, her thin arms wrapped around a battered cardboard box. The street lamp above sputtered weakly, spilling a fractured light over her pale face, her tangled hair catching the glow in strands of gold. For a strange, unbidden moment, Richard felt as though the night had conspired to put her there. Waiting specifically for him to notice, he slowed. Against his better judgment, Lily did not rise, nor did she call out. She only looked up, blue eyes meeting his with a steadiness far beyond her 5 fragile years. In that gaze was no begging, no pleading, only a quiet determination that seemed to slice through the noise of the city. And land squarely in his chest, Richard exhaled slowly, unsettled. He was used to people wanting things from him: money, favors, connections. But this girl offered instead. In her trembling hand, she lifted a single daisy, the petals pale and delicate. Her voice breaking the silence like a thread of glass. "Would you like to buy a flower, sir?" The words were soft, almost lost in the hum of a passing car. Yet they carried with them a weight that made his throat tighten unexpectedly. He crouched without thinking, knees bending until his eyes were level with hers. Up close, he saw the details that distance had hidden away. Her faded dress clung to her narrow shoulders, the rawness of her small knuckles gripping the box, the faint trembling in her lips that she tried so hard to control. She was cold, exhausted, but unbroken. He should have stood. He should have walked on. That was the reasonable choice, the expected one. A man like him did not stop in alleyways for shadows. A man like him did not let himself get pulled into other people's tragedies, and yet he stayed. Something deep, long buried stirred. The sharp scent of the daisies reminded him, impossibly, of another night, another figure. A memory flashed uninvited. His mother's hands, thin and feverish, clutching a wildflower he had brought her as a boy. He had been too young to understand then, too powerless to save her. Now, staring at the child before him, the past and present collided with such force that his breath caught. "Why flowers?" His voice was quieter than he intended, almost rough. She blinked at him, surprised by the question. "Because Mama likes them," she said simply. "And I need to buy medicine." There it was. No manipulation, no performance. Just truth, spoken in a voice too young to carry such heavy words. For a long moment, the street held its breath. Richard studied her face, her eyes steady despite the trembling of her hands. He could walk away, return to his world of marble floors and glass walls, and the child would remain just another shadow he never saw again. But for the first time in years, Richard Hayes found himself standing at a choice that had nothing to do with contracts or profits. A choice that was far heavier, and though he did not yet know why, his heart told him, if he walked away tonight, he would never quite escape this moment. The daisy trembled in Lily's hand, its white petals fluttering faintly in the draft that curled through the street. It was so small against the vastness of the night, so fragile in its simplicity, and yet she held it out as though it were treasure beyond measure. Her wide blue eyes stayed locked on the man crouched before her, as if she were offering not just a flower, but her final lifeline. "Would you like to buy a flower, sir?" The words, barely more than a whisper, echoed in Richard Hayes' chest as though they had been shouted. He didn't answer at once. He couldn't, for a man who prided himself on swift decisions. The silence that stretched between them was unfamiliar, unnerving. His gaze lingered on the daisy, on the thin hand clutching it, on the determination in her voice that trembled but did not falter. A thousand excuses surged through his mind. He could smile politely, offer a coin, and continue walking. That was what people did. That was what he had always done. The world was filled with children who wanted, with hands stretched out and eyes pleading. You couldn't stop for them all. If you did, you would be swallowed. That was the logic, the rule he lived by. But this girl was not pleading. She was offering. Something about that subtle difference cracked through his defenses, leaving him unsettled in a way contracts and rivals never could. He looked at her box, at the neatly arranged daisies glowing faintly under the faltering streetlight, each one set carefully as if order could transform weeds into wealth. The effort, the quiet pride, it reminded him of himself long ago, when survival meant taking what little you had and shaping it into something more. "Why flowers?" he asked again, though he already knew the answer. He wanted to hear it from her lips. Her gaze did not waver. "Because Mama likes them, and Mama needs medicine." The way she said it was matter of fact, stripped of drama. No tears, no theatrics, just truth. Truth so pure it pressed into his ribs like a blade. He felt the ground tilt beneath him. He should have looked away, should have risen and turned his back. Instead, he stayed crouched, caught in the gravity of a child's steady eyes. Medicine. He repeated softly, almost to himself. His throat tightened against memories he despised. The hospital corridors, the smell of antiseptic, his mother's fading smile. The helplessness that had gnawed at him until he learned never to feel it again. He had built an empire of steel and glass to keep that helplessness out. And yet here it was, reflected in the girl's trembling hand and a flower that weighed more than gold. His chest rose and fell slowly, deliberately, as if he were bracing himself. He reached out, not quickly, not with the practiced assurance he usually carried, but cautiously. His fingers brushing against hers as he took the daisy. The stem bent under his grip, delicate, so easily crushed. He held it up, studying it in the uncertain light, and felt something shift in the silence between them. How much? He asked finally. Her lips parted, and for the first time that night, she faltered. No one had asked her that. No one had gotten close enough to care. A coin, she whispered. Just one. Enough for medicine, a coin. Such a small request, so impossibly vast in what it meant to her. Richard stared at her, at the way her small shoulders squared as though she were daring him to laugh, to mock, to dismiss her like the rest. She looked so ready to be denied, and yet so unwilling to lower her hand. It was not just courage, it was defiance. The quiet kind born not from arrogance, but from desperation. Suspense tightened around the moment like a noose. Would he give her what she asked, a coin, a token, and vanish into the night? Or would he shatter the fragile script of her hope and leave her with nothing but the coal? Richard Hayes, the man who never stopped, the man who had built his life on never hesitating, felt the weight of the decision pressing down harder than any contract he had ever signed. And for reasons he could not yet name, he knew that whatever he chose in this breath would haunt him forever. Asterisk. Richard turned the daisy slowly between his fingers, watching the petals quiver in the night air. It was an ordinary flower by any measure, fragile and unremarkable. Yet in that moment it felt like a relic, a talisman of something he had tried all his life to bury. The silence between him and the child stretched, heavy and unbroken, until at last he asked, "Tell me, why these flowers?" Lily looked down at the box in her lap, where the rest of the daisies lay lined like soldiers. Her hand hovered protectively over them as if they might vanish if she wasn't careful. "Because Mama loves them," she said softly. "She always said daisies are happy flowers. Even when everything else feels sad, daisies look like little suns." Her voice trembled, but did not break. She lifted her gaze back to his, blue eyes luminous in the weak light. "And Mama's very sick. The doctor said she needs medicine. So I thought, if I can sell the flowers, I can buy it." Richard's throat tightened. Her words were so simple, so direct, that they cut sharper than any plea. She didn't embellish, didn't dramatize. She just told him the truth, and in that truth was a weight he recognized all too well. He remembered sitting at his mother's bedside, holding a wilted wildflower he had plucked from a roadside, praying without knowing how. He had been powerless then, a boy with no wealth, no influence. He had vowed never to feel that helpless again and had spent his life building walls of steel and money round his heart. Now, here was this child, fragile and trembling, breaking through every wall with nothing but daisies. He shifted slightly, unsettled by the intensity of her gaze. "And you think someone will stop? Buy them?" he asked, his voice low, not unkind but edged with something she couldn't name. "I have to," she replied, her small chin lifted in quiet defiance, though her shoulders quivered with the cold. "If I don't, Mama might not." She trailed off, swallowing hard. The silence left the word unspoken, but it hung between them like a shadow. Survive. The street seemed to lean in, the night listening. Richard felt the old ache twist inside him. He should have looked away, told himself it wasn't his problem. But her words coiled around his ribs and refused to let go. He glanced at the daisies in the box. They were arranged so neatly, carefully lined up despite their uneven stems, as though she believed order and care might transform weeds into something priceless. "Did you pick them yourself?" he asked. She nodded quickly. "From the field near the river. Mama showed me once, before she got sick. She said daisies grow in the toughest places, even where nothing else will." Her voice softened, growing almost reverent. "So I thought, maybe they'll grow hope too." Richard stared at her, and for the first time in years, his carefully crafted world wavered. This was not just a child clinging to desperation. This was a child who truly believed that daisies could buy tomorrow. And the belief was so fierce it made his own cynicism feel suddenly hollow. He clenched his jaw, fighting the surge of memory. His mother's voice, weak but warm, came back to him. Flowers don't change the world, Richard, but they can change a heart. He had dismissed those words then, replacing them with numbers, deals, and relentless ambition. Yet here, on a broken sidewalk, a stranger's child was forcing him to hear them again. Lily hugged the box closer, mistaking his silence for doubt. "They're not weeds," she whispered quickly. "I know they look plain, but they're good flowers. I promise." The desperation in her voice cracked something in him. He saw the faint tremor in her lip, the stubborn lift of her chin as she fought to keep her dignity. She wasn't just selling flowers. She was selling her hope, petal by petal, in the only currency she had. For a moment, Richard could not breathe. This was not supposed to happen. He had walked 1,000 streets without stopping, had trained himself to glance past shadows. And yet tonight, fate or something crueler, something wiser had placed this child directly in his path, as she was forcing him to decide whether he was still a man, or just a machine made of money and ambition. The daisy in his hand seemed to grow heavier, its fragile stem bending under the weight of the choice. He looked back at Lily, at her defiant little figure hunched against the cold, and the truth struck him with the force of a blow. If he walked away, she would break. Maybe not visibly, maybe not immediately, but something inside her would crumble, and he would never forget her eyes. Richard Hayes, who had mastered the art of moving forward without pause, found himself balanced on the edge of something he did not understand. And for the first time in a very long time, he was afraid. The coin never left his pocket. Instead, Richard closed his hand around the daisy, its stem fragile against his palm, and straightened to his full height. The air around them seemed to shift, charged with a decision Lily could not yet see. She hugged the box to her chest, her small body rigid, as though preparing for the inevitable moment when he would walk away. But Richard did not leave. "How many do you have?" His voice was low, deliberate. Her blue eyes widened. "All of them," she whispered, glancing down at the neat rows of daisies, as though afraid he might laugh at their simplicity. "I'll take them," he said. The words hung in the night like a spark. Lily blinked, unsure she had heard correctly. All of them?" "Yes," Richard replied, his gaze unwavering. "Every last one." Her lips parted, the faintest hint of disbelief breaking through her guarded expression. For hours, no one had stopped. For hours, she had sat alone with her fragile hopes. And now, here was a man saying he would take everything she had to give. Her fingers tightened on the box. Suspicion flickered across her face, not the kind born of mistrustful experience, but the innocent kind that comes from disappointment too many times. You don't have to, sir," she said softly, as though giving him permission to leave, to undo the miracle before it could shatter her heart. Richard crouched once more, so his eyes were level with hers. "I know I don't," he said, his tone sharp with conviction. "But I will." Slowly, carefully, he slid the box from her lap. She let him, her arms trembling with both cold and disbelief, as though releasing it meant surrendering not just flowers, but the last thread holding her together. He glanced inside, at the daisies lined up in rows, and something in his chest shifted again. These were not weeds, not tonight. They were her hope, gathered and arranged with the care of a child carrying the weight of a world far too heavy for her shoulders. "Where's the pharmacy?" he asked. Lily's breath caught. The pharmacy? "You said your mother needs medicine," Richard said, standing now, the box steady in his hands. "Show me where." For a moment, she froze. The street around them seemed to close in, shadows lengthening. This was a stranger, a powerful man with eyes she could not read, offering more than she had dared dream. Part of her wanted to believe. Part of her, the part that had survived 5 years of hunger and uncertainty, whispered to be careful. "What if you don't come back?" she asked in a trembling voice, her hand hovering near the edge of the box as though ready to snatch it back. Richard's jaw tightened. "Then I'll take you with me." The words fell heavy, final. She blinked, startled. Her bare feet shifted against the concrete, the instinct to run colliding with the desperate need to trust. She glanced toward the dark street, then back to his face. There was no mockery there, no pity, only a resolve so firm it frightened her. He extended his hand. The world seemed to hold its breath. Lily stared at it, her tiny frame shivering in the night. Slowly, as though each second stretched into an eternity, she placed her cold, trembling fingers into his dot the moment their hands touched. Something in both of them changed. For Richard, it was as though he had stepped out of the glass tower of his life into the raw, unfiltered world he had avoided for so long. For Lily, it was as though the night's endless silence had finally cracked, letting in the faintest promise of light. "Come," Richard said quietly. "Let's get your mother what she needs." Together, they began to walk, his long strides slow to match her small, cautious steps. The city around them seemed to shift as they moved. Storefronts shuttered, neon lights buzzing, the distant rumble of cars, but the only sound that mattered was the soft scuff of Lily's bare feet. Beside his polished shoes, the walk was not simple. With every step, Lily glanced up at him, still unsure if she could trust, still expecting the world to pull the promise away. Richard felt the weight of that gaze pressing into him, a silent demand to prove himself. The responsibility was unlike any contract he had signed, far heavier than billions moved across accounts. This was life. This was hope. As they turned the corner, the pharmacy sign glowed faintly ahead, its red cross flickering like a beacon in the dark. Richard tightened his grip on Lily's hand. He had not planned this detour, but the truth sat heavy in his chest. For the first time in years, he was not walking away, and though neither of them could see it yet, this night would not only save a life, it would unravel everything they thought they knew about themselves. The pharmacy's bell jingled weakly as they stepped inside, the sudden warmth fogging the glass door behind them. Richard guided Lily gently forward, the battered box of daisies tucked under his arm. The shelves glowed under sterile white lights, stacked with rows of bottles and boxes she had stared at countless times through the window, but never dared to enter. Now, standing here beside a man in a gray suit, she felt both too small and too seen. The pharmacist blinked at the unlikely pair, but said nothing when Richard strode to the counter. His voice was clipped, commanding, the tone of a man who expected to be obeyed. "The medicine," he said, "the kind prescribed for a high fever, shallow breathing, something strong enough for a frail woman." The man behind the counter hesitated, studying him. Ben nodded. Within minutes, a paper bag rustled into Richard's hands. He paid without a flinch, no fumbling for change, no weighing of costs, just a smooth withdrawal of bills from a leather wallet. For him, it was nothing. For Lily, it was everything. She stared at the bag as he handed it to her, her hands trembling so fiercely she nearly dropped it. This will help her," she whispered. "Yes," Richard said firmly. "It will." They left the pharmacy, the street swallowing them again. Richard didn't lead her toward his waiting car. Instead, he looked down at her bare feet and asked, "Where's your home?" Her instinct was to hesitate. Home was fragile, private, a place where the walls were thin but the memories clung like smoke. Yet something in his eyes, steady and unyielding, made her point. "Just there," she murmured, and guided him toward a narrow alley. The deeper they went, the sharper the contrast became. The CEO's polished shoes clicked against uneven pavement, his expensive suit brushing against walls mottled with peeling paint and mildew. The air smelled of damp stone and rusted pipes. This was not the city he knew, not the world of gleaming glass towers and perfumed boardrooms. It was survival, raw and unvarnished. At last they reached a crumbling apartment block. The door hung crooked on its hinges, paint flaking like old skin. Lily slipped inside with a practiced ease, leading him up a flight of stairs that groaned beneath their weight. Each step felt like descending into a mirror that stripped him bare, forcing him to see not just her world, but his own emptiness. Her apartment door creaked open. The air inside was stale, carrying the faint, sour scent of fever and damp blankets. The space was small, one room serving as kitchen, bedroom, and living area. A cracked window let in a draft that made the single candle flame flicker. On a thin mattress in the corner lay a woman, pale and motionless, her breathing shallow. "Mama," Lily whispered, hurrying forward. She knelt beside the mattress, clutching the medicine bag like a holy offering. "Mama, I brought help." Richard remained at the threshold, frozen. His gaze lingered on the frail figure, on the hollow cheeks and the sweat-damp hair plastered to her forehead. And then, suddenly, a shock ran through him, something familiar in the curve of her jaw, the shape of her brow. A memory stirred, blurred but insistent. The woman stirred faintly, her eyes fluttering open. For a moment, they landed on Lily, then they shifted toward Richard. Her lips parted, a hoarse whisper escaping. "Margaret." The name cut through him like ice. His mother's name. Richard's breath caught, his hand tightening around the box of daisies until the stems snapped. The walls of the room seemed to close in, the past bleeding into the present. He was not just a stranger who had stopped on a street. He was standing in the center of something much larger, something that had been waiting in the shadows for years, and for the first time since boyhood. Richard Hayes felt a more trapped between a life he had built and a truth that threatened to unravel it all. The room held his breath. Richard stood motionless near the doorway, the box of daisies still in his grip, crushed stems and loose petals slipping through his fingers. The single candle's glow wavered, throwing his shadow across the wall, a tall, sharp figure that looked as out of place in this broken apartment as a glass tower in the ruins of a battlefield. On the mattress, Lily's mother stirred again, her eyes struggling to focus. She had the pallor of someone half buried by sickness, yet when her gaze fell on Richard, clarity cut through her fevered haze. "Margaret," she whispered again, the name dragging old ghost into the room. Richard froze. His chest tightened, his breath shallow, as though the word itself had wrapped chains around his throat. Margaret Hayes, his mother, gone for decades now, but never forgotten, never forgiven either for leaving him so young. And yet here was a stranger, a sick woman in a crumbling apartment, whispering her name with the familiarity of kin. He stepped closer before he realized it, his voice low, gravel-edged. "What did you say?" The woman's lips trembled. Her hand, thin as parchment, rose weakly from the blanket. You look just like her." Her eyes brimmed with tears. "You're Margaret's boy, aren't you?" Richard's stomach dropped, as if the floor itself had vanished beneath him. He had spent his life building walls, fortresses of wealth and power. Yet in one fragile sentence, they cracked. Lily, clutching the paper bag of medicine, looked between them, confusion knitting her small brows. "Mama," she whispered. "You know him?" The woman coughed, a dry rasp that shook her frame. "Not him. Not exactly. But his mother. She saved me once, long ago, when I had nothing. She gave me food, shelter, kindness." Her voice quavered, the memory burning brighter than her sickness. "And when she passed, I thought all that goodness was gone from the world." Richard's throat constricted. His mother, the woman he had worshipped, mourned, and buried deep in his heart, had carried her quiet compassion into places he had never known. She had touched lives that her son, in all his billions, had ignored. The sick woman's eyes flicked to Lily, tender and fierce even in weakness. "She is my daughter. Your mother's kindness lives in her, lives through her." Her gaze returned to Richard, piercing through him as if to weigh his soul. "You didn't stop here tonight by chance. No. You were brought." The words struck him harder than any boardroom battle. He looked down at Lily, who stood clutching the medicine to her chest, her wide blue eyes waiting, questioning, hoping. The fragile daisy petals scattered at his feet seemed suddenly like breadcrumbs on a path that fate itself had laid out. For years, Richard Hayes had believed he was untouchable, master of his destiny. Now, in a one-room apartment that smelled of damp walls and fever, he realized how small his empire truly was compared to this. The fragile thread of connection tying him to a child he had nearly walked past. Lily's voice broke the silence, soft but steady. "Sir, will Mama be better now?" Richard knelt slowly, his knees brushing the rough floorboards. He met her eyes, and for the first time in decades, his voice softened without effort. "Yes, Lily," he said, though his throat threatened to close around the words. "She will. I'll make sure of it." It was not just a promise about medicine. It was a vow, binding and unspoken. He would not abandon them. Not now. Not ever. The woman on the mattress smiled faintly, exhaustion pulling at her features. "Margaret would be proud," she whispered, before sleep tugged her under again. Richard bowed his head. His mother's name echoed in his ears, not as a ghost, but as a guide. The daisies in his crushed hand no longer looked fragile. They looked eternal, small suns against the dark. When he lifted his gaze to Lily once more, something unshakable had changed. She was no longer just a girl selling flowers on the street. She was family. She was redemption. She was the child who had given him back his mother's legacy. Outside, the city rushed on, unaware that within a crumbling apartment, a millionaire CEO had been undone and remade by a daisy and a child's quiet courage. And Richard Hayes knew, with a certainty that chilled and comforted him all at once, that his life and Lily's would never be the same again.